All right. Hello, everybody. We have a very, very special Blogging Heads that I'm super excited about. We've got Jeff Chang, author of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, which is probably the best journalism book you'll read on hip-hop and its origins, and also author of the new cover story for Vibe magazine on Obama and the new coalition. And in the background, Jeff, welcome, by the way, and in the background is Jadakiss's Y remix, which has, I think, the first mention of Obama in a hip-hop track by Common, and this is from 96.
Right. Really? Okay.
I'm pretty sure. Before there was the Black Eyed Peas, before, My President is Black and all that other stuff, was Common's verse in the remix of Jadakiss's Y.
Oh, you said 2006. Or not?
2006.
2006.
Yeah, no, in 2006.
I was like, 1996. Damn, you were pretty prescient there, man.
No, 2006,
Okay.
He says he's still trying to get Osama. Why don't we impeach him and elect Obama?
Right. Yeah.
Well, Com, who is from Chicago,
Yes.
may get his wish.
Yes, he may.
All right. So welcome to Blogging Heads, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Likewise, I'm really happy to sit here with you, Eli. Looking forward to this.
Absolutely. All right, so let's just jump off right now and talk about this very provocative piece you wrote for Vibe magazine. And you want to summarize it for us about sort of youth. There's a new majority for Obama out there, and they're young and they're multiracial. Is that right?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this campaign is that there's been a lot of talk, of course, about the youth vote for Obama. But I think it's more important for what it may actually represent, which is potentially, if Obama wins, and I'm not even going to, a week out, get all excited about these polls and that kind of thing. I mean, anything could happen still yet, but potentially what it could mean is the beginning of the undoing of about 44 years of really nasty racialized politics in the U.S. And I think that it is in large part due to hip-hop, actually, that hip-hop in a lot of ways culturally prepared the way for the U.S. to be able to look at, seriously, a biracial candidate, a young biracial candidate for the highest office in the land. So I think that if you look at the demographics are obviously heading that way. Two of five folks under the age of 18 are of color, that we're going to hit a new majority-minority country anywhere from 2028 to 2042, based on whatever projections you want to use. And at this point, when we're looking at what the election can symbolically mean, it's about sort of this final repudiation, hopefully, of what we've been seeing happening since the Nixon-Wallace election back in 1968. Nixonland, Pearlstein,
yes. I said in an earlier dialogue that I'm going to start talking about Mondale Land. Okay.
Does it exist, though?
A little joke there.
Where's Mondale Land?
Actually, I got a little beef with Pearlstein, but we're not going to get into that now.
Okay, got
it.
But
let me ask you this. Don't you think, though, that to a certain extent the conservative movement that attracted a lot of what were called Reagan Democrats in the 80s, a lot of these voters were, do you think they were voting because they were racist, or do you think they were voting for Republicans because they were racist? Do you think they were voting because they were genuinely had very serious concerns about crime rates, they had serious concerns about things like wage and price controls and whether that was a good way to manage the economy, or whether, don't you think that there might have been less sinister reasons in some ways for a lot of people voting for Republicans, at the end of the 70s and in the 1980s.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I'm not going to sit here and say that all the voters for Reagan in 1980, all the voters for Nixon and Wallace were racist.
Well, no, Wallace voters were racist.
But
they were racist.
I'm sorry?
The Wallace voters were racist. He was running an openly racist campaign.
Wallace's voters were racist. Yeah. But clearly Nixon... all the way through Reagan, they made racialized appeals. We can't deny that. What's interesting is beginning in the 80s, what you begin to see is I think a pullback from a commitment to racial justice, which is really what we had. I think in the middle of the 60s, there was a consensus in the U.S. at least sort of a legislative consensus, a consensus in terms of what we needed to do public policy-wise to move forward in terms of racial justice in the U.S. And by the time you get to the 80s, that's completely broken down. And there's no sort of alternative that's being offered, really, by the other side. And I think that it's continued that way all the way up until, recently. I think that Jesse Jackson may have come out in 1988 and tried to do that, and for a time was able to make a little bit of headway within the primaries, the primary process. But at some point, even the Democratic Party at that point wasn't really ready to look at that as a serious possibility. One of the things I think that makes the Obama campaign made it catch fire so quickly was that people said, hey, this can actually happen now. And I think that's why you got this sudden tidal wave of support happening in communities of color, not just African American, but also Latino and Asian American and Native American communities as well. So,
well, I think that there is clearly has been a long tradition of a politics of racial resentment, and that Wallace's campaign would be the kind of apex of that.
Right.
But I got into this before, but I'm wary of relying too heavily on a concept of semiotic racism, which is to say that the implied meaning of various statements or issues is to sort of stir up the reptilian brain in this sort of ugly racial caste history. Can I ask you why not? I mean, like on certain levels, don't discursive or semiotic debates reflect to a certain extent what's really happening behind these policies? I mean, you can't deny that the net effect of a lot of what we saw with the sort of Just Say No campaigns developing into these strong sort of on crime campaigns, led to racial disparities in the criminal justice system. There is racial disparity. I'm against the drug war. I know that I was against the drug war in the 1980s when I was a tween. I've gone from left to right, but I maintain to be against the drug wars and so forth. But there was, I think, the reason why. I mean, crime is a legitimate issue that should be discussed when there were high crime rates. I mean, you get into this in your book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop,
yes,
where you talk about how there was an incentive for people to commit arson in the Bronx. So a whole borough of New York was constantly burning because of a kind of failed criminal justice system. Now,
well, actually, no. The argument there was that the laws around insurance actually allowed people to profit off of arson. That landlords could criminally, burn down their own buildings and make more money from insurance policies than they would by taking in actual rent.
Well, I think
so that's different from saying that the criminal policies actually led them to burn down their own buildings. Criminals burn down the buildings, but not criminal policies, I'd say.
Well, all right, but there was also a failure in general in the Bronx to have effective law enforcement. You had the equivalent of what they called Fort Apache in the Bronx, where you really had a police force that was largely white, that you just didn't have very good policing, and policing is better now, and there's less crime in the Bronx, and the primarily minority citizens of the Bronx are better off than they were, at the kind of nascency of hip hop. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, the interesting thing too, though, if you talk to the old schoolers, is that a lot of the reason that the Bronx parties were able to develop was because of this sort of really interesting, on the one hand, like hardcore policing, of the type that we saw amplified all the way through broken windows theory and the quality of life programs that have been put in place by not just folks like Rudy Giuliani, but all the way through Willie Brown, in San Francisco, that are really about tough on crime in poor neighborhoods and communities of color type policing. The stuff that led to this sort of spate of police killings in New York at the end of the 90s. The interesting thing about that is that you have that going on. So the beginnings of the development of that in the 70s in New York City. But you also had, on the other hand, like this complete we're not even going to go there type of vibe. Like the police aren't even going to go to the park.
Right. And you and add to that corruption.
And that's why the parties were able to start. A lot of the parties were able to actually get going because you had these open spaces where young folks could actually gather after the gang era had ended because they figured out how to piece up. They figured out how to forge truces so that people could actually come back out on the streets again and party. The cops, there's a great story that Charlie Ahern tells about making the movie Wild Style, which is one of the classic movies of all time.
Highly recommended.
And he said, highly, highly recommended. But he says that, that last scene when they're doing that big show in the amphitheater, right? Right. They didn't bother to get any permits. They just went down there. Lee painted the building just like you see it in the movie and stuff like that. And they went and held this big show. Tens of thousands of kids showed up. The night of the show, the cops start seeing all these folks gathering. They roll up to the park, and they see all this stuff going on. And Charlie comes out, and he's like, we couldn't wait for you guys to get here. Thanks for coming here. Can you guys stay here and just, kind of make sure that things are going well? And the cops took a look at that, and they got in their car and just left, and they never came back. That was actually going on a lot as well. So you were able to see the development of this culture. So in the spaces, I guess I'm saying, where young people were able to take control, they had these creative explosions occur. And I think that's what you see happening in a lot of ways. We emphasize a lot this idea of resistance. It's sort of, this sort of academic liberal, academic radical type of idea and stuff like that. But, there wasn't actually resistance going on. The cops just pulled out and let the stuff happen. Yeah,
well, there was a combination of neglect, brutality, and I would also add corruption. But I'm saying all of these issues were eventually addressed sometimes in measures that were harshly criticized by liberals in the city of New York, and sometimes by things like community policing, ombudsman, and better kind of liaison relationships between local precincts and their communities. But nonetheless, I'm saying that in the late 1970s, a lot of Americans were worried, and crime was a central issue for them. And they felt that the Democrats didn't have a clear answer on it, and the Republicans exploited that. And kind of back to the point about semiotic racism, there has to be, I think it's very legitimate if there's high crime rates for there to be discussion of crime in our politics. There has to be. And that the problem sometimes with the semiotic critique is that by focusing too much on the subtext, we lose the ability to sort of speak in plain language. And, as I think in this campaign, while I don't agree that, Obama is a radical socialist, his connection with left radicals in Chicago before he became a national politician seems to me a fairly legitimate case for the party that is opposing him to make, and it does not necessarily mean that they are playing to that this is the equivalent of like what I think is a legitimate example of semiotic racism, which is the Jesse Helms ad where they have a white guy crumpling up a job form and someone say you could have really used that job, but it went to a minority candidate. That is deliberately playing on a kind of resentment and a racial resentment. Whereas I think like bringing up William Ayers is just saying I think Obama may be a secret socialist, and I don't see the connect there.
Oh, okay. So wait, let me see what your argument here is. So you're saying that you don't agree either with the argument that that you don't necessarily agree that the attack on Obama using Bill Ayers as a way to bring that issue up is any more useful than the argument that one's racist because they associate with Jesse Helms.
I'm saying I think Jesse Helms legitimately he had racists who were voting for him, and I think Dick Morris made the ad, right?
Okay.
And they made this ad legitimately say you're unemployed, and the reason you're unemployed is because a black person got your job. Now that I think is an ugly kind of politics, and I'm happy to condemn it. I'm saying that bringing up William Ayers or sort of commenting on like what is a community organizer. I'm not racist, but I'd like to know what a community organizer does.
Let me tell you, because I used to do community organizing. Okay,
say it again.
I'm a former. I'm sorry.
Say that again. I missed that.
I'm a former community organizer, I traffic with community organizers and with domestic terrorists. I've written an afterword for one of Bill Ayers' books. And so, for me, like, if you don't necessarily feel like, or if you feel like something's wrong with Dick Morris bringing in Jesse Helms because of the context in which Jesse Helms is working, then I think it's fair to also bring up the context within which community organizers and Bill Ayers are working now. Bill Ayers is somebody who is done a lot around educational reform that both conservatives and progressives celebrate. And the association between him and Obama is very thin. It's still extremely thin. This is the type of situation where they were on a board many, many years ago. They happen to live in the same neighborhood. Bill Ayers doesn't necessarily practice the same politics that he did back then. I don't practice the same politics that I did back then. You don't practice the same politics that you did back when you're a socialist. So, it's things change. These days, Bill Ayers is one of the leading, I think, educational reformers. It's fair, I think, to be able to bring in that
reform
context.
In what direction? I'm not an expert in education reform, so I'm not going to speak. I'm going to confess my ignorance, but...
around education, I think it's the same thing that a lot of people that actually even supported No Child Left Behind moved it in, and that's to look at the folks that are the poorest performing, that are caught in the poorest performing schools, people, young students of color, poor young students of color, a lot of times that are in the schools, and looking at solutions to try to figure out ways to improve educational outcomes. I think that's actually something that both progressives and conservatives agree upon, that we have to look at these divides that we have around class and race and bridge them. And that's the kind of stuff that Bill Ayers has been working on. So when he asked me to write the afterword for this new book on city kids, city teachers, I was really happy to do that.
Okay, all right. I didn't know that.
I want to make a real quick point, too, about community organizing. And it goes back to the Bill Ayers point, because I think what's happened here is folks are going back and trying to fight the culture wars of the late 60s. And so for community organizers, this is simply a way, I think, for the argument to be drawn back to the Black Panthers, who are community organizers, and before that to, red baiting, the communist community organizers, right? There's not too much of, forget the semiotics of the communists and community organizers, but getting to it, I think there's a line there that they're trying to go back to that connects community organizing, to radical upheaval in the inner cities and riots and fires and all this other kind of stuff.
Saul Alinsky is one of the great theorists of 20th century community organizing, and he was kind
also
of
from Chicago, right? Exactly.
Yes.
And he wasn't kind of a commie at all, actually. He was anti-communist. But the thing is that he was about trying to get people in the neighborhood organized, because there wasn't a stoplight on the corner and cars were speeding through and killing kids, or different types of things. There's different levels of community organizing. You've got that kind of issue going on. You've got issues where there aren't enough resources being sent to certain parts of the city to build parks or to fix up bathrooms in schools or that kind of stuff. And that's what community organizers do. Community organizers go out and try to fix the problems, I think, that are going on in the communities. What was really interesting to me is the day after Palin's speech, when I was at the RNC in St. Paul, that a lot of the folks of color, and there weren't a lot of folks of color, but a lot of the folks of color that were there, that were Republicans, were, really upset, I think, about the community organizer baiting. That some of them had been community organizers, Some of them had worked through their churches in community organizing. And they just felt like, gosh, nobody's really letting them know, somewhere at the top of the party, that this is how we see community organizers. The whole joke was that, Jesus was a community organizer and Pontius Pilate was a governor. And that was the thing that started running around the day after that. But, there were people within the party, I think, that were marginalized within the party, that felt, I think, pretty bad about that comment the day after she had made it and Rudy Giuliani had made it.
Yeah. Are you there?
I'm here. I'm definitely here.
Good.
Are you not hearing me, or is
no, we're all good. We're all good.
Okay, good.
We're all good. I want to just pick up on that. First of all, if I could say, a big Alinsky fan is Grover Norquist, who started the Taxpayers, who's very much a man of the right. And Grover has credited a lot of the strategies of Alinsky, at least, if not, some of his sort of broader conception of the polity, as one of the reasons why he has been successful in kind of the grassroots Leave Us Alone coalition that's more on the right. So, indeed, there is just a kind of political neutral thing. But you mentioned something about, like, refighting the wars of the 60s. I'm going to disagree with, like, even a lot of conservatives we really like David Frum. And I think that there is something very legitimate in terms of, it's not like a lot of the 60s, I don't believe that the 60s radicals just went away. A lot of them took over important academic institutions and cultural institutions.
That's
and
true.
While certainly...
Well, it didn't take over. I don't necessarily think you see anybody,
Yeah. The people aren't burning
in a
flags and
president
bras in the
position
streets
or that
anymore,
kind of thing. People are tenured maybe, or people might have jobs in administration or something like that, but they're not necessarily running, I think, all of higher education in America. I don't think that's what you're saying, but I don't think that that's.
Well, I'm saying that a lot of 60s radicals, to give an example, like Bernadine Dorn, now have tenured jobs in the universities, and a lot of people who were very radical in the 60s. Now the question is, are they? I mean, obviously they have given up in the far extreme, like the Weather Underground, domestic terrorism as a means to accomplish a political goal. And for all this, we're all very thankful. So we do have a kind of domestic peace, but are they? But I'm also against. Forget the means. I'm also against some of the ideals of the 1960s as well. And it seems like it's relevant to sort of say that there are these kind of ex-hippies who are, in charge of important institutions and I see it in journalism in my field, I see it in other things. And, are they just simply, kind of on the inside, still in some ways pursuing a lot of their goals? And again, I believe that Barack Obama is going to probably be on a lot of issues fairly center-right. At least that's how he's campaigning. So I'm in a strange position here because I actually don't think that these data points of his pre-national career tell us anything about necessarily how he's going to govern. And in that I would disagree with other conservatives. But at the same time, I just want to say I think it's legitimate, and it's not the same as George Wallace or Jesse Helms or kind of really ugly racial politics that sadly was inherited by the Republican Party and the right after the Democrats obviously kind of radically changed their party in the 1964 Voting Rights Act and so forth. But, I'm happy to say I hope this election is the last election where but I don't really see it from McCain Palin right now as sort of playing into those very ugly kind of dog whistles out there with regards to race. And I picked it up, Jeff. Not just you. A lot of people are saying that is, in fact, what's going on, that they are kind of playing that. They're trying to play that card.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that they're trying to play the card in a very subtle way. I mean, it's not the kind of thing where it is a dog whistle type of vibe. But I do think that if you've got people that are yelling out terrorists or kill him, kill him. You know what I mean?
Well, but the Secret Service, the Secret Service looked into that, and that's not true.
Shut that down. What's that?
Well, I know, but they looked into it and they couldn't find evidence of it. And if we were to take every kind of supporter of Democrats, I could cite for you stuff on the Huffington Post.
Absolutely, yeah. No, you're absolutely right about that. But I think that one of the things that's really interesting is the code word action that's kind of going on. Hardworking Americans, real America, fake America.
Yeah.
These are all code words I think that are trying to take folks back in time. I think that they're trying to recall these old frames that were set up, these old tropes that were kind of set up through the culture wars of the 60s, 70s, and really played out. I think you and I were probably both on campus in the 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah.
We saw that a lot. That was the stuff that we were fighting out on the quad every day. And I think that that's the kind of stuff where it's subtle. And the thing that's interesting to me is that it hasn't worked. People are kind of beyond that. The code words don't mean anything anymore. Maybe because too much time has passed. Maybe because they just never really had that much currency anyway. Maybe a combination of the two. But I definitely feel like there is dog whistle racism that's being brought up in this type of campaign. And I hope that that it's not going to be coming back. I hope that this election hopefully moves us past that.
Well, if I could say
on that, I think,
on this issue, one of the things a couple points, and I don't have polling data on this, but there have been some YouTube videos at McCain rallies that showed Muslim Republicans who were McCain supporters yelling at a lunatic talking about taqiyya and so forth, about how Obama's a secret Muslim and all this stuff. And my favorite of this sort of example is I have a good friend in Nabras Kazemi who is an Iraqi and a Shiite. And he wrote a whole column called Hussein in Name Only about how he felt that John McCain was the real Imam Hussein, the great martyr of Shiism, and that Obama was actually did not deserve the great honor of his middle name, which I thought was a wonderful twist and a wonderful, a kind of American moment, right? Because, there are I think that there are quite a number of Kurdish Americans and Lebanese Christian Americans who were going to vote for Republicans because of foreign policy, and they kind of like the idea of the Bush doctrine because they especially Iraqi Americans knew how awful Saddam Hussein was, and that to sort of this moment that you're going to scare the real America by, pointing out Obama's middle name. And here's my friend Nabras pointing out, how the name is really the moniker of McCain. I thought that was great.
Yeah, and Eli, this is really interesting to me in the long run, right? Is sort of what happens when you start actually getting beyond those sort of strictly racialized appeals and really start getting down to questions of where people are at, on the issues. It's a really interesting thing. But the Republican Party has basically ceded all that away. Because if you look at what happened over the last 4 years, let's say 8 years really, when Bush came into office, Karl Rove had a big, plan around trying to increase the Latino vote for the Republican Party. And he had a plan as well to try to look at bringing over a number building on sort of the black conservative bases that they had, because of folks like J.C. Watts. And so the Republican Party under Ken Mehlman spent a lot of efforts actually going out and trying to make this type of stuff happen. They were looking to try to create a permanent Republican majority. And they crazily failed in the last administration. The last 4 years, it's completely fallen apart. Nobody believes in it anymore. Latinos have fled the party in huge numbers because of immigration. Asian Americans, same thing.
Well, McCain is the nominee, by the way, and McCain's the nominee, guy.
McCain's the nominee, but I think for Latinos, when they look at this particular situation, right, and sort of McCain tacking towards immigration reform and then turning against his own bill. And I think Asian Americans the same way. Looking at this kind of stuff, you kind of have to wonder what's going to happen in the end. And if he can't bring his... And I don't blame McCain. I blame the fact that McCain's trying to work with the party that he's working with. You've got a situation where people are looking at that saying...
I mean, that's
he's a Republican. He's a Republican, yeah. But my larger point here is that they have, I think, in a way, lost a lot of folks that might be conservative on different types of issues. Arab Americans, perfect example. A lot of folks were voting very solidly Republican, and they've moved, pretty staunchly into the blue column over the last, 4 years because of a lot of the issues. So,
well, I think people aren't going to vote for Republicans that have nothing to do. I don't think it has to do with you're absolutely right. The GOP for 20 years has has felt that they could get African American voters because of a lot of reasons. African Americans tend to be more socially conservative than other elements in the Democratic coalition, and also, African Americans, on back to the original issue of the crime issue, tend to be more supportive of things like the death penalty than other constituencies within the Democratic Party. That is all true. But I think this year, Republicans are kind of basically screwed because they used to be able to make at least a claim to being competent at governing, and with the collapse of the financial markets, with the collapse of the stock market, with Katrina and on, I think the Republican brand is now associated with incompetence. So it used to be that you had the choice between the stupid party and the evil party, but now the Republicans are just stupid and evil, and so they kind of have to rebrand,
They do. They really, in a bad way, have to. It's true.
I want to talk, this is a great treat for me. I read Can't Stop, Won't Stop when it came out, and I've been a reader of yours for some time now. You may not, the viewers may think this is bizarre, but I I've been listening to hip hop since the Sugar Hill Gang when I was in 4th grade.
Yo, you got records, man. I seen you, man. You got a big old shelf. You got records.
I've got records. I used to, not really much anymore, but I used to go to like kind of freestyle rap stuff in my neighborhood.
Can you kick it right now, man?
I can't really. I'm not going to kick a freestyle right now. Not on the internet. Maybe it's some other point. Maybe at some other point. But anyway. In fact, there's a whole incident at I don't know. Do you know that site Soulstrut? Do you know Soulstrut?
Soulstrut, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I'm on
Who doesn't know
Soulstrut, and I once posted a.
What's
a rap once
what's
on
your moniker?
What? Vitamin.
Vitamin. Oh, okay. We got a Vitamin on Soulstrut.
I'm on the Soulstrut. So big ups to the Soulstrut Nation.
Wait a minute, Eli. You're a key styler.
Yes. Well, anyway, no. Let me explain. This is a story.
Wow,
it's an embarrassing story.
I love this.
This is an embarrassing story. I posted like a rap that was like my friends like kind of like recorded, and they wanted to I posted it because people were posting free. And at the time, I was like really into this Elton John song called Indian Sunset, which was about Native Americans. I was like, if Elton John is not a Native American, like I could do something as a Native American. And so, anyway, I did it, and everybody like hated on me for like a month, and it still comes up. And it's like they all accuse me like I'm so insensitive to the plight of First Nations and like all this other stuff. And so it's kind of I'm like wary of doing it right now. But
wow, you should get together with Outkast, man.
Yes.
You know how they dressed up in green Mardi Gras Indian suits and stuff for the Grammys one time?
Oh, they did?
Yeah, sure. Oh. Yeah.
Outkast is great.
A lot of my friends are really upset about that.
So I love hip hop, and in a very indirect way, I suppose I consider myself. I don't know. I'd like to consider myself a part of the hip hop nation, and I care about hip hop. So I want to talk about one of what I think is one of the most provocative theses about hip hop that I've heard. And it's a political thesis. It's the Questlove idea, which is that if it weren't for the recession of the late 70s and the early 80s and the crack epidemic, we wouldn't have hip hop as we know it. And I want to know, what do you think of that? It's
a really interesting thesis because it functions in a lot of different ways, right? One is the creativity thing, the sort of, all important creativity comes from struggle. And then there's another sort of angle of it, which is that if it weren't for crack, to dramatize sort of what was happening in these abandoned, forgotten areas during the middle of the 80s, you wouldn't have had people interested in what was actually happening amongst young people there. So the sort of media amplification aspect of it as well. And of those two, I actually tend to agree more with the second than the first. I don't necessarily feel like, I'm not a big believer in the sort of struggle equals creativity type thing. There's a lot of struggling areas in the world where creativity doesn't have a chance to even thrive or take root because things are so bad. And I've been, a real big fan of Jamaican music over the years.
Oh yeah.
And I think that in the years in which there was the most sort of political violence and street violence and sort of unrest, in the last decade, those are the years that there was driest for dancehall. That the music just wasn't very good. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can kind of disprove that. But I definitely do feel like there was a sort of sensational aspect to the whole crack epidemic. It was something that in large part was a media creation. No, I mean I have to take that back. I mean it was a real deal, but I think that the way that it got amplified was to become a core part of actually political campaigns about being tough on crime and the drug war. And I think that out of that, you had an interest in this sort of ancillary interest that comes along with it of like, well, what are young people doing there? What do they look like? What do they dress like? How do they move, right? What do they like to listen to? And of course, at that time, hip hop was beginning to really burst out. It was a whole new generation of hip hop that was coming out after Run DMC, and the music was turning really scary. Right. First time I heard Schoolie D, I was like shook. I was like, wow. I remember listening to Eazy-E. I was listening to Eazy-E. I was living in South Berkeley, and it was the kind of place where you could look down. Like we were on the second floor, you could look down on the corner, on Saturday night, and there was all kinds of activity going on. On this block, there'd be crack sales going down, and in the alley in the back, you'd have cops, beating people down at the end of the night. It's like Rodney King wasn't necessarily anything surprising. And I'm talking about Berkeley, you know what I mean? South Berkeley. So you can imagine like how it was going down in West Oakland and East Oakland with Felix Mitchell and stuff doing the thing. So I think, Questlove's thesis is so compelling because it brings all those different types of things together. But, the people that were making the music weren't dealers.
But they were, in some cases, they were bankrolled by dealers, as we know with that book Queens Reign Supreme. That's all about it's amazing,
book,
incredible.
NWA is a really good example because Easy was a dealer and he didn't start as an artist, but Ice Cube wrote all his rhymes, and Cube was never somebody that was out there that was slanging. He was a kid that was bused from South Central to the Valley to go to school, and had, in some respects, the opportunity to be able to do that. A lot of the stuff that first came out were tall tales. They were big myths. I think this is a point that I was making in my book. They were grains of truth that around which you concocted a really big story. And these kinds of things were set to these really stark beats. I mean, when they stripped down the sound, right, and kind of took everything out after Run DMC and kind of you just have this echoing beat and the boys in the hood are always hard over that. You're just sitting there in your room in South Berkeley listening to that stuff and you're just like, whoa.
Yeah, well, can I say
really, I still get goosebumps thinking about it now.
Can I say one of the things I love about America is that someone like Ice Cube, who in the early 1990s and the late 80s was kind of, I guess you could say, like a poster child for at least like the establishment's nightmare, is now making barbershop movies. Now one could say, how'd that happen? Right? How'd that happen? How'd that happen with Cube? Right? But I say that's kind of great because this country does not have, like Europe does, sort of waves of extreme fascism or waves of extreme sort of socialism. We tend to sort of moderate a course where fewer people get killed, obviously with the Civil War being an exception. And there are moments, of course, when there is days of rage and there are riots and so forth. It's not a perfect theory, but I'm saying one of the reasons is because our culture is able to absorb, and one could argue from a kind of leftist critique, at least watered down and homogenize kind of really hardcore violent and anti-establishment messages, right? And Ice Cube would be a perfect example, correct?
Yeah, and it's part of the mythology of America, right? I mean, The Godfather is at the core of who we think we are as Americans in some ways. The Godfather story, it's like the classic American narrative. Right. Even more so than the USA trilogy or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I think like for Cube, it's a really interesting type of thing.
Cube is a guy who white people could like count as their neighbor now, right? I mean, they could. I'm just saying. And whereas
people would be like, what happened to him? And I'd be like, I'm not mad at the guy. Like his life course has kind of followed my life course. I wasn't like that, but I wasn't like America's Most Wanted. But I'm just saying he was somebody I could look up to then, and now as a dad with 2 kids, I can look up to him still in a way.
Right. I mean, right. Whereas, I mean, I think that there was an element of his message, you could call it that was, almost sort of valorizing a kind of sociopathology, when he was extremely racist against the Korean community, and, he was, he's like, death certificate, America, most, and that kind of stuff is, was I think, especially because it came out around Rodney King when we were looking at, it was a very different time, and we were looking at saying, hey, this may fall apart.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it seemed like Ice Cube was one of these people who was kind of like fanning the flames a little bit, at least in his music, and then...
not a little bit, a lot.
A lot, okay, right.
For sure, yeah.
Right, then there's a transition with that movie Friday where he's like really into weed, And then he goes and makes Barbershop, which is like, and now, I'm surprised. I'm sure he'll show up on The View, Ice Cube's on The View.
Yeah, he probably will. And I'm glad he's alive. I'm glad he's doing his thing. I'm glad
there you go.
We're all getting older earlier.
Right. Whereas I think in Europe,
older in this.
Right. In Europe, the radicals just kind of stay really radical. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I want to just getting back to just the Questlove thesis about crack. Okay. Now, one of the things I think we have to just acknowledge is that there is a lot of rap, not all rap, but a lot of rap. And there was a moment actually in the late 80s and early 90s when there was quite a bit of like kind of Afrocentrism, and it was a more politically diverse period, right? But then it seems like, and Common's song, I Used to Love Her, is an example of this, about how it really, for a long time, and we're still in it, it seems like a lot of commercial rap is about selling crack, or how you used to sell crack. In the case of the Re-Up Gang, the Re-Up Gang, the Clips?
Sure.
It's almost like their music is about the food science of making crack. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's
the tiniest details of making crack. Yeah,
exactly. It's like
the boring recipes of making crack.
It's like it's crack recipes, right? Exactly. So there is this element where it's not all of it, okay, but it seems like a whole lot of the hip hop canon is about dealing drugs.
Mm.
I mean, I'm not saying all of it. I know that there are the exceptions, and but even the exceptions are sort of sometimes derided, like backpack rap. Or like, there's that Roots lyric, I rap for, white kids in coffee shops and stuff. But to be really authentic, you at least have to sort of assume a character. And it's interesting because you get into all this stuff in your book about Ice Cube sort of not really being as hard as he kind of came across, or at least not as hard as Eazy-E. But, to this day.
I don't know if I put it that way in front of him, but yeah.
Right.
Like, I wouldn't be like, Ice Cube, you're not hard. I wouldn't be like that, man. Okay. I would never do that to his face.
All right, no, I don't mean it like that. I
know what you mean. I know what you mean. I hear you. Yeah.
But I'm saying that like we have a lot of this stuff out, and to this day, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of that out there. I'm not, as I said, hip hop it contains multitudes, right?
Yeah, no, I definitely hear what you're talking about. I think it's part of the larger, what they say in advertising, aspirational aspect of hip hop. Because hip-hop has always been about, like, in a way, having things, right? You go back to the earliest raps, it was about, like, checkbook, credit cards, more money than a sucker could ever spend, right? It was like having things, I got a color TV so I could see the Knicks play basketball. Like a color TV, wow. Back in 1979, I guess that was the thing they have, right? So in a larger sense, I think it's about that paper chase. I mean, even indie hip hop, right, has a lot of songs about like we're on the paper chase. We're out there trying to make the cash. We're out there trying to keep the lights on and stuff. And the crack story, and I think the Clips is a really interesting example of that. The crack story is something that I think it plays into a long-standing sort of racialized trope. Of something that's illegal, something that is beyond the bounds of society, something that's violent and plays into the racialized trope of this is what black males are supposed to be.
Right.
And I think that in that sense, if you look at what's happened over the last decade or two, especially since media deregulation, media consolidation started taking place in a huge kind of way. What you've had is the commercial machines, I think, pushing that particular thing a lot more. Even as we've had situations in the neighborhoods where drug selling has actually gone down. You know what I mean? Where violence has dropped off in a huge way. Those myths still are being promoted in a huge kind of way. I wouldn't say necessarily that most of hip hop is about drug selling, but I would say that the overwhelming amount of hip hop is about being aspirational, and it fits into that definitely.
Well, here's, if I may, let me do something that I'm sure you'll disagree with, but
okay.
I could make an argument that at least among the kind of sub-hip-hop genre of the kind of, I guess, gangster rap, okay, that McCain and Republicans should be their party. So let me
agree with you on that. Actually, unfortunately, if you're hoping to provoke me on that, I think I would agree with you. But go ahead.
Okay, well you may agree with me. So let me make the argument. One, there's a tremendous amount of conspicuous consumption that is advertised in a lot of the gangster rap music about how nice things are. As you said, not just My Color TV and the Sugar Hill Gang, but to this day, that song "My President is Black" by Young Jeezy says, "And my Lambo's blue." Who can afford a Lambo? Okay, number two. Joe the plumber may not be getting his taxes raised by President Obama, but certainly Fat Joe the rapper will be, right? Because a lot of these rappers are in a tax bracket that would have their taxes raised by Democrats. Number three, Democrats tend to favor treatment for drug programs, and if your main income, or at least your apparently your main income now is from rap, but if your main income before you have a kind of a kinship with drug dealers, you don't want to be for the party that will fund more drug treatment, right? Yeah,
there should be an anti-drug rehab lobby.
Right, and at least among gangster rappers where prison time is something as sort of a mark of true authenticity, only one candidate in this election has spent any significant time in jail and incarcerated, and that's John McCain. So McCain is really the candidate of at least the gangster rappers, I think.
Do you think if McCain was sagging, like if he was wearing his jeans low and that kind of thing, that he would be able to pick up more of the vote? The hip-hop vote,
no.
You know?
I don't even know that John McCain is aware that there is this thing out there called rap. No, I'm just kidding. I don't even think he's like aware of it, but I'm just saying that McCain could craft a narrative in a targeted market that would sort of appeal to, the illicit aspirational gangster rap fan.
He could, and I've actually heard this argument made a million times within certain circles of hip hop conservatives, actually.
Right.
And so I guess the question is why aren't they trying to go after that type of vote, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily occurred to them, but let me tell you a funny story. In 2004, for the second inaugural for Bush, I was talking to a Republican, and I sort of said, why is it that all of the musicians that are for Republicans, for the most part, suck? And the Democrats seem to have a monopoly on all the really great artists.
It's Eli, because it's about country first.
Right. Okay. Fine. But anyway, and I said, well, there was a brief moment. Apparently, Kid Rock, who I don't like, by the way, is a Republican, but he wrote a song. He wrote a song back in the '90s about doing Barbara Bush in the tush. So he couldn't be invited to the second inaugural balls. Because they did the research and they're like, and I was like, well, why?
That's why they had Sammy Hagar instead.
Yeah, I was like, they should invite Jay-Z. Jay-Z seems to be like Jay-Z is a kind of corporatist Republican now. The Republicans that at least the Republican narrative is that the great Republican narrative is like T. Boone Pickens. Like I started off with a paper route and now I have billions and billions of dollars. Right? And it's similar, Biggie says, this is dedicated to all the people, in the buildings I was hustling, on the buildings, in the complaining of the buildings I was hustling from, and now look at me, he's smoking chronic.
Yeah. No. I wonder how much of it might have to do, Eli, going back to your drug war, anti-drug war type of thing, with the fact that the industry that Jay-Z made his first fortune in was actually illegal. What if the Republicans had actually gone all the way and legalized drugs? Would he be a Republican now, right?
Well, but I don't think the legalization of drugs would be good for the gangster rappers because...
No, not at all.
Right, because they thrive in this thing. Right, it's part of it is the kind of the combination of violence and capitalism that creates this. I mean, I think at times. I think in some ways. Gangster rap now.
Well, but this is what I'm saying is what if it had been legitimate to sell drugs, back then, and he had made his fortune that way legitimately? Then he might have been invited to the Republican fundraiser the way that Eazy-E was back in 1980.
Right. Eazy did go to Republican
1988 or something like that. Yeah, he was invited. Actually, no, 1991. Eazy was invited by George Bush the first, H.W. Bush, to be a fundraiser for the Republican Party. He got to have dinner with the guy.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
It was one of the greatest moments in hip-hop history.
Right. Right. It's kind of like deeper than when James Brown endorsed... Didn't James Brown endorse Nixon?
Yes.
Yes, James Brown endorsed Nixon too. So
that's true. Well, Shaka Khan played at the 2000 convention, and I was so sad.
She did?
Yeah, she did. She and Brian McKnight. Of course, by that time, everybody was leaving. Nobody really wanted to. Who is this person singing? I'm like, that's Shaka Khan. That's Shaka Khan. That's Brian McKnight. One. So it was like, it was kind of a lost thing. That was also the year, too, that Colin Powell made the big push for affirmative action. And everybody kind of either left the room or kind of went like this at the end, like, oh, thank you, affirmative action. Okay, whatever.
Yes,
and that's
I remember
where they're
that.
at
Yes.
now. That's where they're at now. So
right. So we have a little bit of time left. I want to just kind of query you on, and then we can maybe just talk about, as a hip hop journalist, let me say something provocative. It seems that your book, which was a lot of reporting in it, and books like Queen's Reign Supreme, are kind of rare in that there's a lot of hip hop journalism which is just really criticism. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm.
And so who do you like in terms of the hip hop journalists?
Who are my favorite writers? Everybody's kind of descended from Greg Tate, I think.
I think Tate, Flyboy and the Buttermilk is a great collection of essays. I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, I think the family trees all kind of trace back to Greg Tate for most of us, and Nelson George for sure. Those are the two people that were really doing it for us and kind of inspired us and really created this industry in a lot of respects. I mean, for me, this list could go on. We could talk for another hour about this, but David Toop, Stephen Hager, they were the first two people that did really in-depth journalistic takes on hip-hop as a culture and a movement. And so if you get a chance to check out David Toop's Rap Attack,
I will. Yeah.
Or Stephen Hager's hip-hop, original hip-hop, which is it's contained now in this book called Adventures in the Counterculture. And it includes, I think, 2 or 3 of Stephen Hager's books from the early 80s. Those are classics. I mean, these are folks that did some really hardcore reporting, and they're resources that I still draw on today. I also sort of am a big fan of Trisha Rose, who kind of single-handedly almost invented the field of hip-hop studies. She did a book called Black Noise that won all kinds of awards back in 1996, I want to say it was published, or 97 that it was published. And another book came out by my friend Brian Cross called It's Not About a Salary. That's out of print, unfortunately, but it's about Los Angeles and hip-hop in Los Angeles, and it's all sort of oral histories. Those are kind of the folks that really, like, nuts and bolts inspired me. Of my peers, everybody from Joan Morgan to Dream Hampton, Chris X, John Caramanica, Oliver Wang. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yes, you mentioned Oliver Wang. I think Oliver Wang is my favorite kind of critic, and I love his blog, Soul Sides.
Yeah, Soul Sides.
And he's your comrade,
really
right? You guys are collabing on what do you have some projects that I know I've seen the two of you on, right?
Yeah, actually, people actually mistake me for Oliver a lot. So this is actually my chance to say I'm not Oliver Wang. You see my face here. You can go and look at his picture on his blog. You guys can put them next to each other. We're not actually the same person, although we're very good friends. And sometimes he reads my mind, and sometimes I read his. But anyway,
Oliver's smart. Oliver's a really smart guy,
Oliver's
and I like
really smart, and he's brilliant. He also is able to really, I think, link up a lot of stuff, in terms of the music from different eras, and put it all together and kind of lay it out there. Ned Sublette is somebody, I think, who is often underregarded, but Ned Sublette is a genius. He's done 2 books now. The first is called Cuba and Its Music, and the second is about the music of New Orleans, and they're both amazing books.
Okay.
These are histories of music that go back literally thousands of years, and bring you all the way up to date. And so you can listen to the latest salsa, in Brooklyn, or go to Washington Heights and hear merengue and that kind of stuff, and you can basically feel it through the writing that he's doing. He's doing a book now on New Orleans that takes it all the way from going back from carnival music all the way up to bounce. And I think it's just going to be an amazing book to read. Garnet Cadogan, Jamaican American writer, is doing a book on Bob Marley now. Joe Schloss, who's got a new book coming out around hip hop dance, which is, I think, very, very understudied. Brian Coleman, he's got a book out on it's sort of one of those best albums type of thing. Everybody gets to tell their classic album story, from KRS to.
Well, I have to ask. So, can you give me, like, in no particular order, your favorite hip hop records? Even though I understand hip hop, some people think it's a 12-inch format. I understand, but.
There's no way. I think the record that really, really did it for me in a lot of ways was Rebel Without a Pause. I think that record still to this day is just it's a shocker. And I think it represents everything about the hip hop aesthetic that I try to emulate in so many ways. Something that's fierce, something that's like even though there's a loop going on, it seems to change. All the time. Like, there's different nuances of this that you can hear all the time. Chuck, in his poetry and his lyrics, kind of breaking all these different types of images up and kind of spitting them, all back to back and that kind of thing. I mean, that's like Rebel Without a Pause is kind of the way that I wanted to tell Can't Stop, Won't Stop in a lot of respects.
Yeah.
So, but there's, the list can go on and on and on. I know you got Soul. The Death Certificate album. The music of the Far Side or the Freestyle Fellowship,
Freestyle Fellowship.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. That's a blast from the past. Nice.
Yeah. No, the Freestyle Fellowship. I was really.
I think I could quote a freestyle verse. Right? A Freestyle Fellowship. I'm trying to. What was that verse like? That's why I never borrow, so I have to do a stick up tomorrow. That was a Freestyle Fellowship.
I think so, yeah.
Right.
There's so many different styles that were going on in that. And, I was really happy and privileged and lucky in this life to be able to get down with folks that I started a label with, DJ Shadow, Black Alicious, Lyrics Born, Lateef the True Speaker, the folks that are part of the Mighty Underdogs now, Get the Gab and Lateef. And those were the records that we used to sit down and listen to all the time. The Freestyle Fellowship records came up to us, I think, 91, 92, 93, something like that era, and just broke it wide open for us. You could just see all these different possibilities. You could literally see the arrows going in these different directions, from real, like, Gothic and Baroque, to straight, like, freestyle, cornbread, right? The cornbread rap that AC Alone does. It's just, there's so much variation on that, on those two records that they did. That's just amazing.
Right. Jeff, I'm going to take the prerogative as on Blogging Heads to.
Okay.
This is a Soul Strut related question. Do you think I'm a cultural Philistine for saying that one of my favorite, at least hip hop mix, if not one of my favorite, is Sound Bombing 2 off the Raucous Records label?
Wow.
That had 1999 on it by Common, by the way.
What's that?
The 1999 was first put out on that record by Common, which I think is my favorite Common song with the Sadat X verse in the middle. And it also had.
You're really a backpacker too, huh? You're a key styler. You're a backpacker. Wow, I'm learning all this stuff.
I don't know if I'm not a backpacker because I'm not really down with their community organizing and their political message, but. But I like the Raucous record because it had like a little bit of both. It had that Medina Green song. I just thought that was a moment for me, at least in the late '90s, and I really liked what Raucous did after that with Black on Both Sides. I loved the original Reflection Eternal stuff, and Black Star, obviously, which was also the same group, I guess, but with Talib and Mos. But what happened? So many. We could do this forever, but finally, what happened to Mos Def? Mos Def is now like with Immortal Technique saying that maybe Bush brought down the towers. And like Mos used to be, I thought, like the most clear-headed of all the rappers.
No, I'm not sure. Mos is still doing his thing in the community, just a week or two ago, he was out in Defirmary Park in Oakland doing an amazing jam there. in the same park, literally where the Black Panthers used to hold their rallies in West Oakland. And, literally thousands of people came out, and it was amazing. It was a really amazing moment. People were sitting there in the park going, wow, we never do this anymore in West Oakland. So I got a lot of love for Mos Def, and I really like the stuff that he does. I like what he's done on stage, in the theater. I like what he's done in the movies. I like a lot of the stuff. His music of late, I've been less, I think, into than a lot of his other art. But the fact that he's still out there as an artist, and I think this is one of the real important things about hip-hop that a lot of people don't get, is that in hip-hop there's a huge value in, paying back to the community and being close to the community in that kind of way. And it takes shape in all these different
not gangster
ways.
rappers. Gangster
rappers.
rappers.
I think look. I think that if you look at a lot of what a lot of those rappers are doing for the communities, it's a very quiet type of thing. But it's the type of thing where there's a story that's told about Bob Marley, where that at the time that he died at Hope Road, Bob Marley was singularly responsible for the livelihoods of thousands of people, and I think that you see that in a smaller way with a lot of rappers from their neighborhoods. You know what I mean? They're responsible for the livelihoods of a lot of those folks. They're taking care of those folks. And there's a reciprocal relationship in some respects because the stories are still coming in that way. It's still their lifeline to the neighborhood that they grew up with. But a lot of folks really support that.
But I think there's a disconnect. If you are bringing violence and something that sort of like replaces the state with a gang operation.
But Eli, listen to yourself. You're a big hip hop fan, right?
Yes.
And you are somebody that listens to the clips as hard as me or anybody else does, right?
True.
And I think that it's really hard in some respects to say that all the stuff that they do is about violence. That's the soundbite. I know that's not you, Eli. It's like it's the type of thing where the art is there. Some albums are better than others. Some albums are a lot better than others, right? But it's a range of experiences. It's a range of stories that's being told. And this is where I come down a lot more on Russell Simmons' side than I do on somebody else's side. John McWhorter's side.
Right.
that there's good art and there's bad art, and fans like you and I sort this stuff out on a daily basis. We'd be like, yeah, I'm tired of the clips talking about, like how many liters it takes of this or of that to make the crack. Like I don't want to hear about that kind of stuff anymore. And we'll have big debates about that kind of stuff. So
there are moments in clip songs which are more reflective. I'll give you that, and it's
absolutely.
But
absolutely.
At the same time, I mean, there's value to giving you the wartime snapshot, to use a verse from that song Hip Hop from Mos Def. And that, in some cases, right. And hip hop manages to bleed out of everybody knows about hip hop now. White people, all kinds of people see hip hop. And so it's a way of saying, hey, this is the reality of my life. This is the reality of my community. And there is some positive value in that. So I'm not like Dolores Tucker on this. But what I'm saying is that there is sometimes a point where I think rappers can valorize what is ultimately a very negative kind of activity and almost a kind of negative arrangement, for a community where the hero becomes like this guy who, managed to sort of seek vengeance for someone who killed one of his friends or something like that. Or we wrote about this in the email. We're not going to get into this though because we're at the end. But I really draw the line at Too Short, telling people how to become a pimp. I think prostitution is the last vestige of slavery in this country because a whore is owned by a pimp. And when you have people sort of elevating that, and you see people sort of talking about how it's just the game. No, this is a tragedy for young girls.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so I'm not saying I'm not against it. I like hip hop. I'm into it, and I listen to a lot of this stuff, and I know it's more complex. But I do think it's hard sometimes to say. I think Mos Def is an exception. Mos Def has never portrayed himself as a banger. He's always been something else. And I think Nas also skates that line. He's never portrayed himself as a banger. Nas is always kind of he's like a reporter. You know what I'm saying? He's telling you what's happening in his world. But there are other guys The Game or other people like that who really just, their character is the Don, the kingpin, you know?
Well, yeah, but, you know, Too Short also did The Ghetto. You know, like you take a song like The Ghetto, which is a rewrite of the Donny Hathaway song.
Yes.
And I mean, it's deep. You know, I mean, that was a song that actually, and I grew up in the Bay, or I grew up in Hawaii, but I spent most of my formative hip hop years in the Bay. And so I'm supposed to be predisposed to love Too Short, but I didn't really hear Too Short until I heard The Ghetto, you know, blasting out of people's cars in the ghetto. And then you begin to understand sort of what the whole thing is. I mean, and again, too, it's a whole thing of like, I agree with you about prostitution. I agree with you about pimping. And I think that that's something that folks in hip-hop have fought a lot harder than folks outside of hip-hop. People on Fox News or armchair sort of critics of hip-hop. Folks in hip-hop have been fighting that kind of thing for a very, very long time. And there are ways in which that I think goes unnoticed. So I mean, I'm definitely agreeing with you. I think all I'm saying is that, you know, in the way that we understand hip hop, it's often through racialized eyes, and I think the burden of resolving misogyny and violence in this country, at least within the popular culture, comes down upon the side of, you know, folks of color a lot of times. And I think it's important to point that out a lot of times. You know, we don't necessarily talk about the violence of Clint Eastwood's movies and how that is destroying the American psyche, but we can talk all day about quote-unquote gangster rappers. We don't talk necessarily about the misogyny of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone movies, you know, but... You know, or Quentin Tarantino or whatever, but we'll talk all day about how black men dehumanize black women. So, I mean, if we need to have some balance on that, I think, as a
right, so you think
sort of
like,
cultural
by the way, you know,
question.
you want to know how to solve the problem. I don't think it's to solve the particular problem of what I would say the prostitution industry. Incite a prostitution revolution.
Right.
That's what I want. I want regime change on the streets.
Whoa. Are you saying that we should unionize prostitutes?
I'm not even saying we should unionize prostitutes. I'm saying prostitutes need to organize it first and understand that they are in themselves should be in an armed struggle.
You said that prostitutes should organize for armed struggle?
That's what I'm saying. Okay. I'm another radical. And then
I got you.
All right, listen, this has been great, Jeff Chang. I really recommend anybody... can I just say this? Well, I'll say this because I really, really like the book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop. Anyone who watched this whole dialogue till this point at the end, and you kind of want to like just learn about hip hop and you know just sort of this thing. Read. I have it right here with me. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Read this book because this book will really tell you what you need to know about the origins of it and put it in an important geopolitical context. And then go rent Wild Stop. Those are my
yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, man. It was a good dialogue. All right.
Really appreciate it.
All right, cool, man.
Bless.
Later.